Good evening. My name is Ben Fisher. I'm a catechist here. I work for Jason. He's my boss. And so I've been a catechist here at the cathedral for about a year. And before that, I was a catechist in the Diocese of San Antonio for several years. I've worked in RCIA ministry there. I've been an RCIA director. So I've seen a lot of faces in rooms like this, faces of people that are interested in the Catholic Church. And but I don't by any means think that I've seen or heard it all. There are an infinite number of people with an infinite number of stories, and as Jason alluded to, an infinite number of questions. And so when you work in RCIA, you learn to kind of go with the flow and handle whatever comes along. So Jason's absolutely right. When you're part of this process of investigating the Catholic faith, learning about it, and then hopefully joining officially, questions come up, confusions come to your mind, things that you think going in, things that you've never thought of going into the process, that in the middle of it all you suddenly say, I've never thought about that, I've never had any reason to think about that, but now that it's been presented to me, I really would like to resolve it. I really would like to understand it. I'd like to clarify it. Well, the only way you can do that is to stand up, shout, raise your hand, ask someone to do something. People involved in the ministry in RCIA, the one thing that we don't want is we don't want people to go through the entire process, join the church with confusions, with things that they would like to know. We don't ever want anyone to feel swept along. Well, I didn't like what I heard. It confused me. I didn't agree with it, but I'm already in this thing. I'm already doing this. People expect me to do this. I'm just going to be quiet and go along with it. Don't do that. Don't do that. This is a big, complex, wonderful thing that you're doing. You can take as long as you like to do it, and along the way, you should learn everything that you'd like to learn. You should resolve everything that you'd like to resolve. It's a big decision, right? So I made this particular decision along with my wife, who's sitting up here at the front table. Her name is Amy. And we made this decision together in 1998 in Memphis, Tennessee at St. Francis of Assisi Parish. I was raised Southern Baptist. She was raised in the Presbyterian Church. And we did this together. And I can tell you that it was a long, emotionally fraught process. There was some shouting. There was some crying. She did the shouting. I did the crying. And anyway, but after a long time, we got through this, and we definitely were secure in our decision to become Catholic, despite all the bumps in the road. And there were a lot more bumps to come after we became Catholic. But we're very happy being Catholic, and I don't think that anything on heaven or earth could talk us out of it at this point. We're real Catholic. We try not to be obnoxiously Catholic. If we're ever obnoxiously Catholic, I hope somebody tells us. We try to just be real Catholic. Anyway, the topic that I was given to talk about tonight is pretty technical, but I know that most people don't approach religion and their relationship with God in a technical way. Some people do, however. This is one of the things you'll find out about the Catholic faith, is that it's infinitely deep. That if you start down the intellectual road and you say, I'm going to figure this out, you won't exhaust the resources. You won't come to the bottom of it. You won't come to a bunch of question marks. People have been figuring this out since God spoke to Abraham roughly 4,000 years ago. The people that know God have been trying to figure God out. They've been trying to apply their human reason and their human intellect to these questions of religion since then, and we've made a lot of progress. There are not many things that resist the application of human will and human intellect. You can see that humans achieve a lot in every field that humans apply themselves to, and religion is just like that. So when somebody says, well, you can find the answer to your question in the Catholic Catechism, the compendium of all of our teachings, and you go, oh, that sounds pretty cool, I'll buy myself a catechism, and you go to the bookstore and you buy a Catholic catechism, don't be surprised that it's about 4 inches thick. Don't be surprised that what we know about religion is a lot. And don't be surprised that if you were to try to answer a question, a detailed, complex, intellectual question, don't be surprised. There's a lot of information there for you if you want to do that. It's there. But most people, myself included, will never in the course of their life manage to memorize the catechism or do anything like that. Most of us will only, at some points, in some areas, in some questions, will we brush up against this intellectual depth, history, and tradition of the church. But it's all out there. It's all there for anything you would like to discover. I always encourage people, try to discover a lot. Apply yourself to it. There's nothing more important than this in your life. So, you know, as much as I apply myself to figuring out the right parts that go in the carburetor of my riding lawnmower, which I am going to make run one of these days, I should apply myself more to my relationship with God. If I apply my intellect to anything, I should apply it most of all to my relationship with God. And, you know, I'm not the smartest or most educated Catholic. I don't have nearly as many years of schooling as somebody like Deacon Staling there in the back, who's got master's degrees and different things in theology. But where I'm at, I can apply my intellect to it. I can figure things out. I can be taught by the church. There's always things to learn, and I always encourage people, do that. Apply your intellect to it, as much as you apply it to anything else. And I know that jobs tire us out. Riding lawnmowers that won't start tire us out. And I know a lot of times we feel like we don't have the energy. But this is where that extra little bit of effort that you can give on behalf of your relationship with God can really pay off. So we're going to brush up against some of these really deep, complicated intellectual ideas tonight. And we're just going to brush against them and talk about them. And there's tremendous resources. The whole catechism is online. If you've got the internet, you've got the catechism for free. You can buy the great big thick copy and read it. In every RCIA class, every one that I've ever been associated with or taught, there's always one person in the room, thankfully only one, that thought that they had to read the entire catechism before they could become Catholic. Is there anybody in here that's reading the entire catechism? Oh, one. See, raise your hand real high. Two. You can read it in a year on email. You guys are hardcore. So now, I think that is awesome. On the other hand, I want everybody to know that you don't have to. It's just if you really want to go for the gusto and you really want to know everything, you may want to go and ask these people about the email service where it stages your reading over the year. I've known people that have done that, and it's a great way to do it. You can do the catechism one year, you can do the Old Testament the next year, you can do the New Testament the next year. It really works out nicely. So that's great. 2. This is a new record, that there's 2 in one class. That's awesome. Anyway, so with that little disclaimer about the fact that we're going to dig a little bit, scratch the surface of some of these deep intellectual ideas, I don't want anybody to ever get scared off and say, oh, that's just facts, it's all facts and figures, it's too complicated, this does not sound like religion to me. Well, religion is just as much mysticism and the ineffable and the unexplainable as it is the facts and the principles. Both of these things go together. Religion's not exclusively intellectual, and it's not exclusively emotional. It is, if we are made for God, and if we're made in God's image, that means that the way that we are is we're really built for this job of understanding Him, which means it's going to engage. The relationship we have with God is going to engage our intellect, it's going to engage our emotions, it's going to engage all of us. So it doesn't leave any part of us out. So don't be surprised when there's facts and things that apply to the intellect, and don't be surprised when there's mysticism and there's things that apply to the emotions. Both of these things go together to form the Catholic faith. And if we're a very emotional person, sometimes we have to bend a little bit to those people that like to have facts. And if we're a very fact-oriented person, then we're often called to bend a little bit to the parts of the faith that are emotional. That both of these things go together. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So, like I said, I was where you are now in 1998, learning about the Catholic Church, considering joining the Catholic Church. My wife and I did this together. I cannot tell you whether that was a good idea or not, because I have nothing to compare it to, but we did it together. Anyway, we both entered the church, and we've been Catholic ever since. And along the way, there were issues that I had to work out before I could honestly become Catholic. Like I said, I was raised Southern Baptist. Being Tyler, I wasn't raised in Tyler, I was raised in the San Antonio area, but being around Tyler, you probably have a lot of friends and neighbors that are Southern Baptist. You may have relatives that are, and you know that we Southern Baptists can be pretty stubborn sometimes. We are particularly stubborn about our Bibles, as you may know, and as a result, these issues, if I can restart the machine here. As a result, these issues of the creation of the universe, the origin of life, the creation of humankind, these are things that Southern Baptists are intensely concerned about. As a Southern Baptist, I talked about these things all of the time. When I was a little kid, I even went to a Southern Baptist elementary school every single day. We had chapel every single morning, and we would often discuss, more usually being an elementary school kid, we were told, but we would often discuss the origin of the universe and the origin of life. This is something we were really, really deeply into. And one of the things that I could never understand, because I had Catholic relatives, I could never understand from my perspective why my Catholic relatives just didn't seem to care all that much. I could never understand why they were not very, very concerned about whether the world and the universe was 6,000 years old or not. I could not understand. I studied this in school every single day. My science textbook at the Baptist school had a picture of a caveman fighting a dinosaur. And I could not understand why this was not of paramount importance to my Catholic relatives. And I had to learn through this process of what this means in Catholicism. Have a question? Or go for it.
We don't have to have a discussion about it, but what's your perspective on A. Georges Lemaitre? He was a Catholic priest.
Yeah, the Belgian Catholic priest that first formulated the idea of the Big Bang. Oh, he's in this presentation, don't worry. Yeah, oh yeah, he's in there, no problem. Yeah, so yeah, we're going to be talking about the origin of the universe, and a real serious discussion of Father Lemaitre and what he thought were the theological ramifications of the Big Bang. That'll take a long time, but we have to do this if you have time afterwards. But we'll touch on him a little bit during the presentation. But that's a good segue. I like that. What I had to come to find out through my process of approaching the Catholic Church, learning about the Catholic Church, is that basically myself and my fellow Baptists, we didn't understand that the Catholic Church had been there and done that. That the Southern Baptist communion that I was part of was only about 1/10 as old as the Catholic Church. And all the debates that we were having, all of the vicious, fiery debates about the importance of the world being 6,000 years old or 16 billion years old, that these were debates that the Catholic Church had had roughly 1,700 years ago. I didn't realize this was old hat for Catholics, that we'd already been through this, that St. Augustine, who lived in the 5th century, had written a book on the interpretation of the book of Genesis. That these things were, this is the Catholic Church, to say that the Catholic Church had been there, done that, and had the t-shirt doesn't even begin to express how well the church had already gone over all these issues, that as a Baptist, I didn't have any of this connection to history. I didn't have this connection to the tradition of the faith. I didn't know who St. Augustine was. I didn't realize that all the questions that I was asking about, well, how can the Bible be true if the Bible says the world was created in 6 days, but when my dad goes to work at Texaco, I know that everybody he works with, they say the world is billions of years old and the rocks they're drilling into are hundreds of millions of years. How do you put these things together? And what I didn't realize is that Augustine wrote about that 1,600 years before I was born, and that he wrote about it very intelligently. I didn't even realize that before Augustine was ever born, I didn't realize that before the incarnation of Christ, that Jewish scholars had raised the same questions in ancient times. That this is something that human beings struggled with and pretty much worked out millennia before I was born. That we were having a fight, a tempest in a teapot, there in the Baptist church. We were so concerned about what the textbooks were going to say in the public schools next year, when the Catholic Church, the reason the Catholics weren't as concerned about it is because the Catholics were sanguine, because they realized that that was not the fight to have. This revelation to me, which I'll share the chain of reasoning with you, was so, so important, because it removes a lot of this tension that we see, which is invented tension, between Christianity and the rest of the world, particularly the world of science, technology, things like that. Catholics don't, and for very good reasons, Catholics don't typically feel any tension, don't tend to get involved in arguments about, don't have angst about these things, because the church has it all worked out. Catholics can read it in their catechism. And once I learned to tap into the intellectual history of the church, these things, I said, oh, why did we fight about that? Why did we fight about it at all? So let's dig into that a little bit. So, the creation of the universe. If you look up creation of the universe in the Catholic Catechism, here I'm talking about why that book is so thick. The Catechism is dense. It's got a lot of information in it because the church thinks a lot of things about this. And one of the things that the Catholic Church, the Catechism of the Catholic Church goes through is it goes through some of the ideas about creation that the church says these are wrong. That's worth reading through. We'll read through them real quick. The idea that everything is God. This is sort of the Oprah Winfrey idea of creation. The idea that everything is God, and God's like a force that runs through the whole world, and like the world's getting bigger and better, so God's getting bigger and better. This is called pantheism. And so the church says, no, it's not right. God is separate. God created the universe. God is not the universe. God made the universe. So then the next idea the Catechism talks about, the idea that there's like a good God and an evil God, that they're fighting like two superheroes, like Superman and Batman are going to fight in this movie with Ben Affleck, which I won't go see. That there's a good God and an evil God, and they're fighting and they're fighting. And there are religions that are still around today being practiced in Tyler, Texas, that have good gods and evil gods. The church says, no, God is one, and God is good. This is what we believe about God. So that would be dualism. Dualism because there's a duality. There's two, the good and the evil. The next idea, which the church says no to, the idea that the world itself is evil. And this is something that I think we steered way too close to in the Southern Baptist Church. Is one of the things that led me to Catholicism. The idea that if the world's created by God, that the world is good, that when the Bible says God saw that it was good about creation, that that's really true, that the world's not an evil place, that the world has problems, which we're going to get to in that part about original sin, but that the world is good, that God created things that are good. And so Gnosticism is that's a tricky Greek term for groups of people 1,500 years ago and more who believed that the world was essentially bad. And that religion manifested in some really interesting ways. Usually it manifests as a suicide cult. And so if you look at different groups that are suicide cults, Jonestown or the Comet people, these groups that crop up, you'll often find strains of Gnosticism. The idea the world is bad, the body is bad, everything is bad, therefore you want to get away from it, kill yourself, right? And the church says, no, these things are not bad. There's sin and there's evil, but you're not essentially evil, the world's not essentially evil. This next idea is interesting, the idea that God created the universe, but after he created it, he just kind of left. That's an idea that was really, really popular among the American founding fathers. People like Thomas Jefferson were really, really big on this. It's called deism, the idea that, yeah, God made everything, but then he kind of is an absentee landlord. And the church says, no, God's real, he's active in human history, he does things. That the things that God does are knowable to us. And this is why we have faith in his action in history. And then the last one, I think everybody will recognize. Others reject any transcendent, that means outside of the material universe, reject any transcendent origin for the world, but see it as merely the interplay of matter that has always existed. I'd say this is the most popular new religion in the United States. It's definitely the most popular religion in Europe. And this is the religion that right now is proselytizing the world. We call it atheism. I dabbled with this for a while. It's interesting. Dabbled in atheism. Anybody that wants to talk about atheism, I'll tell you all about it. Atheism is, to my mind, sort of an adolescent fantasy. The idea that you can close your eyes to the big questions. Where did the universe come from? What's the purpose of life? And just focus on the things I can see right here at this moment. And this way I can concentrate only on things that I can deal with, and there are no big scary questions. And there are a lot of people that make a very good living. People like Ricky Gervais, the comedian, and Bill Maher, the comedian. They're mostly comedians. Make a good living preaching to people through film and television all the time that there's nothing besides the material universe. That if you can't see it and touch it, then it must not exist, therefore God does not exist, therefore life is meaningless. And then you get back to suicide cults. Why not just end it all right now if everything is meaningless? And these are the ideas the church points out and says, these are the things that people fall prey to. This is what Christianity, this is what God offered an alternative to. This is what Judaism and then Christianity offers an alternative to. It's the understanding of what God's plan is. And Christianity says you should be attracted to that. You should be attracted to the news that God loves you. Humankind should be attracted to this. Humankind should be attracted to good news. So we'll talk a little bit about why somebody might not be attracted to that. This is my favorite cartoon about creation. This is God making snakes. And he's rolling them up from clay and he's saying, these things are a cinch. It's an old Far Side cartoon. But you know, this is... I always like cartoons. I like things about creation because it always brings to mind all of the struggles that I had growing up the way I did, all the struggles finding the Catholic Church and becoming Catholic, and it reminds me of all of that and how close this really is to the ideas that I had as a child. This right here, this picture, this is a picture that I saw a million times as a kid. It's a fake. This is a fake. This is a rock that was supposedly chiseled out of a river not far from here in Glenrose, Texas. And this was a picture that we were shown all the time when I was a little kid. It's not. It's actually a carving that was made in a chunk of limestone in Glenrose, Texas by an unemployed man during the Great Depression. But this, the picture of the caveman fighting the dinosaur, and all of these things that we were shown, we were being encouraged to understand Christianity in a very particular way as Southern Baptists. And I don't want to harp on Southern Baptists too much because I still have a lot of friends at Southern Baptists and I love them very much and they are very fervently Christian. But they sort of major in the minors. They major in something that is really not nearly as important as they make it. What we were taught was that to be Christian was primarily to believe that every word of the Bible is literally true. That this is what faith is. That if you have faith, you will make this decision that every word of the Bible is literally true. And then nothing will shake you in this belief. Being in Tyler, Texas, we're very near the buckle of the proverbial Bible Belt. I'm sure that a lot of you are familiar with this idea. Is everybody pretty familiar with that idea? You've heard it expressed? Friends, neighbors? Yeah. So this is what I grew up with. So what we had is we had the idea of religion, that religion primarily consisted of closing your eyes and your ears to everything outside of the Bible, and you went forward on that basis. And when I was a teenager, a very rebellious teenager, I was dating my wife at the time. She can tell you how rebellious I was. When I was a very rebellious teenager and I got into high school biology and I started learning these things that made me feel so smart, I said, this is obviously not compatible with what the Bible says. And I was taught that Christianity meant believing every word of the Bible was literally true. Therefore, as a 15-year-old possessing all the wisdom of a 15-year-old, I said, I have to make a choice. I choose science. I'm brilliant. Of course, it's an interesting statistic to know that most people that are atheists as adults, if you interview them, the vast majority will say they made that decision when they were between 13 and 16 years of age, just the same time I did. Because you know everything when you're 13 to 16 years of age, particularly if you're in biology class or science class or wherever it is, the first time that somebody ever tells you that science and religion are incompatible. This happens to a lot of people. I know it happened to my wife. She's told me the story. And I think it happens to a tremendous number of people. It doesn't happen to Catholic kids nearly so often, because Catholic kids, if they're well catechized, if they're well taught, they grow up with an understanding that the Bible is not a science book. The Bible is a religion book. And that the Bible does not endeavor to teach science. The Bible endeavors to teach religion, which is the most basic thing. If I had been taught that, if I had understood that Christianity, much, much older, much more authentic Christianity than anything floating around where I was, had already dealt with this question and had already said, no, it's not a science book. It's a book that's very, very old. And as you go through this book, which is really more of a library than a book anyway, because the Bible's a library of over 70 books that are written across the span of about 1,400 years, and they record history which happened over the span of several thousand years, that when you look at this library of books that is our Bible, that it is not a science or a technology book, that it captures the human experience, and as you move forward through its books, it begins to capture more and more literal history until you meet people who are so striking and they're so unavoidably historical, like Abraham. Abraham, after a lot of study and a lot of thought, I've come to the conclusion that nobody can convince me that Abraham's story is not very much on the money. It's too compatible with modern archaeology. The things that Abraham does and says, and this is really early in the Bible. This is in the book, in Genesis. Abraham lived somewhere around 4,000 years ago, somewhere around 2000 BC, very roughly. And the story of Abraham in the Bible contains details which modern archaeology only in the last 50 years has confirmed that, yeah, okay, so Abraham bought this piece of land and he made it the family tomb, because that was a big deal in Abraham's time to have a family tomb. The tomb still exists, by the way. It's called the Tomb of the Patriarchs. You can still visit it in the Holy Land. This tomb, which has existed for 4,000 years, when you read the book of Genesis, it goes through the contract. That's one of the things about the Bible. It's kind of boring in places. It goes through all these things like census information, and in the case of Abraham, it even goes through the contract that he makes with the guy that owns the land to buy the piece of land, and it goes through all the details. And modern archaeology has dug up tablets that have 4,000-year-old contracts to buy land. They're worded exactly like what the Bible says Abraham's contract was. So when the Bible is recording something historical in detail and says this is what happened historically, and there's actual information there, then we weren't far off at all as Baptists. On the other hand, the thing that the Catholics had that we didn't have is the Catholics understood that when something in Scripture was poetic, it was probably poetry, like the first 3 chapters of Genesis, which are not a news story. It's 3 different accounts of how the world was created, where people came from, and what happened to us. Chapters 1, chapters 2, and chapters 3. Chapters 1 and 2 are 2 different accounts of how God created the universe, and they're not the same. They're 2 pieces of poetry. And in the same way that poetry captures reality, but not in the same way a news story does, those first 2 chapters are poetic accounts. And then chapter 3 is a poetic account of how we came to be where we are, how we came to be people the way we are. And that little thing, that little understanding, it's so simple and so quick to say, it's poetry. The church has always understood it to be poetry. The ancient Jews even understood it to be poetry mainly. If I had had that understanding, I think it would have helped me out a lot. So I think that's something pretty important to know about the Catholic Church. So, let's do a little bit of this digging through the intellectual information. So, is this idea that the Bible contains poetic things and is not trying to always give us a scientific understanding of things. Is that some really modern idea that cropped up in the last 20 years? No. So first off, you see it first in Christianity explicitly in the works of St. Augustine. But the church makes this point again and again and again. My favorite place that the church makes it is in 1893, Pope Leo XIII, who was one of the popes, there have been a lot of them, he wrote a letter to the church. The letters that the Pope actually writes to the church, not interviews that he gives to Italian magazines, by the way. The letters the Pope actually writes to the church, they're called encyclicals. That's where the Pope's teaching is actually contained. A lot of people this week would like you to think that everything he says to an Italian journalist is like from God. No. No, the Pope can say what he wants to in a magazine interview. The rubber hits the road when he writes an encyclical to the whole church. And Leo XIII wrote this encyclical, and he said, yeah, you should take the Bible to be literally true, he said, except where reason makes it untenable or necessity requires. And he was writing about the book of Genesis. And he said, science is something that people do. History is something historians do. Archaeology is what archaeologists do. And they're going to tell us things that are true. And they're going to develop theories. They're going to test them. They're going to get better and better at their job. And we should let them inform us about the things they can inform us about. So then we get to, so this idea, the idea cropped up during the 1870s, very famous idea, Darwinism, the idea that living things, all the animals on the earth might have a common ancestor. Is everybody pretty much aware of Darwin? I think everybody in the United States probably knows what Darwinism is. The idea that life evolves over time, changes, new species are developed by natural processes. How does the church feel about ideas like that? Well, here we are in 1950, so not last year, in 1950, Pope Pius XII, another pope, wrote an encyclical, and he said, don't place the scriptures on par with myths. He said, the scriptures are not myths. He said, but the book of Genesis gives us a popular description of how these things were accomplished, not a scientific one. It was written in ancient times for ancient people. It would be pretty unbelievable if you had a strict scientific explanation of how genes work and how chromosomes work in an ancient Jewish book. He says, have proper respect for what it is. Got another slide, yeah. He even said, the church does not forbid research and discussions to take place with regard to the doctrine of evolution, in as far as it inquires into the origin of the human body as coming from pre-existent living matter. The Pope said, investigate it. He said, don't worry about it. He said, if you investigate, find out how life came to be on the earth, and if your explanation, the scientific explanation that you come to over time, he said, whatever it is, he said, that's the science of it. But, he said, the Catholic faith obliges us to hold that souls are created immediately by God. The idea that it's fine to investigate scientifically how animals developed. And it's fine to investigate scientifically how the human body developed. There has to be some reason why I share 98% of my DNA with a chimpanzee. God's not a trickster. God didn't make me share that DNA to tempt me to unbelief. Instead, as Catholics, we say, well, that's truth. That's scientific truth. Let's figure out where it leads us. The Pope said, investigate it. Fine. It doesn't bother us. He said, but you have a soul. And he said, this is what makes you different. And he said, don't forget that when you're doing scientific explanations. Don't start thinking that you're an animal. My favorite expression of this Catholic idea about the scriptures, its relation to science, history, archaeology, is from Dave Urban. Dave Urban is really, really worth reading. If you want to do some homework, and you actually want to sit down and read something, because church documents are not exciting page turners. They require a little concentration. If you want to read one of these things, read Dave Urban. Dave Urban is one of the documents of the Second Vatican Council, 1965. And so it's very, very clear. It breaks up the Bible and says, let's talk about the Old Testament, and we'll talk about the New Testament. This is what the church said about it. The Old Testament, these books, though they also contain some things which are incomplete and temporary, nevertheless show us true divine, that word pedagogy means teaching. The Old Testament, some things are incomplete. Some things are a little mysterious, but they're true. They teach us what God wants to teach us. But then you go to what they say about the New Testament, and you can see it's completely different. There's a brick wall around this. Holy Mother Church, listen to how the language changes. Holy Mother Church is firmly and with absolute constancy held and continues to hold that the four Gospels just named, whose historical character the Church unhesitatingly asserts faithfully hand on. Okay, you should get the idea from this that the Church teaches that what's recorded in the book of Genesis, there are some mystical and poetic ideas in there, but that you would make a big, big mistake if from there you say, well, I wonder if what's in the Gospels is also mystical and poetic. Church says, no. No. That's not something that existed for thousands of years before it was recorded. The Gospels, by the way, fascinating topic that everybody who's interested in Christianity should get into, is the dating of the Gospels. When were the Gospels written? Because as people study and study and study the text of the Gospels, that date gets pushed back farther and farther and farther and farther. And now all the credible dates for the Gospels are within about 20 years of the resurrection for the first Gospel. Some scholars even have the Gospel of Mark within 5 or 7 years of the resurrection. And all four of the Gospels were almost doubtlessly written within the first century. The Church has always maintained that the Gospels were written by the peoples whose names are on them. Luke was a doctor. He was the companion of Paul. He followed Paul all around the world. And the Church has always maintained, well, he actually wrote that. And he probably wrote it during the 60s AD. And Mark was the companion of Peter because Peter was probably illiterate. Peter was a fisherman, not a fancy guy. Peter probably couldn't read or write. And so if Peter wrote a gospel, it was probably dictated. Well, that was dictated to Mark probably in Rome, probably during the 40s AD. So these Gospels are recorded very, very soon after the events that they record. In some cases, maybe less than a decade. This is not the stuff of myth, right? If you have Jewish people 4,000 years ago, if you have pre-Jewish people 10,000 years ago sitting around campfires, and they're telling their children the story of how the world came to be, you have to expect that it's going to be a little bit mythical. But what the Church says there is, yeah, there's some mythical language, but look at the truth of what's being said there. Whereas all the rest of the cultures all around the world, they had these creation myths. The idea that the world was carried on the back of a giant turtle, the idea that the earth was sneezed out of the nose of the great god Sulu, whoever it is. Whereas the Jews have this very simple idea and said God did it. God, the one God, the creator of the universe, did it because he loved, and to create something is an act of love. This is a profound philosophical idea, and the Church says this is true. Poetic in its description, but all of the important stuff is there. Does that make sense? So, the topics that we're supposed to talk about, and I ramble terribly. We're supposed to talk about the creation of the universe. We're supposed to be talking about the origin of life. And so I'm just giving you some impressions of things I'd like for you to read about, things I'd like for you to think about, things that troubled me, things that I had to find out to come into the Catholic Church. I think I would sum that up. I would sum up what I had to learn to come into the Church, being the idea that I was raised in a Christianity that was very closed off to the rest of the world. That we had a religion which was necessary because we weren't Catholic. We didn't have councils, we didn't have popes, we didn't have authority, we didn't have priests, we didn't have guides really. All we had was the Bible. So we had to take it and we had to enshrine it in a way that really wasn't right because it really made the Bible sort of untrue. And coming to the Catholic understanding that the Bible is true, but it's not a science book, that it's the collected wisdom of cultures over thousands of years, this was really important. And I think that what best encapsulates that for me was coming to the Catholic Church, was able to enter a religious culture where truth was true no matter where it came from. That whether the truth was discovered by human intellect in the scientific field, or whether the truth was revealed by God through the Church, that truth is true. And that I didn't have to close myself off to anything, and I didn't have to turn off the Discovery Channel because everything on there is from the devil. I have friends that do that. I have friends that do that. Now, I will turn off the History Channel. Everything on there is from the devil, still. But Discovery Channel is okay. Anyway, so now we have to come to the creation of mankind. Does anybody have any questions or want me to clarify any of my ramblings? All right. I don't believe you, but okay, we'll go on. So the origin of mankind. So, absolutely.
I take a lot of heat at work from a couple of coworkers. I kind of have this word, and I call it revolution. For a long time, I felt, I think it's Glenda thought. And so what you're saying is the Catholic Church, its stance is that evolution.
Now, particularly before we answer the question, we'll have to make a point about this and say that I'm not the Catholic Church, but Pope Pius XII speaks for the Church. So what you're talking about is fascinating. I'm glad you brought this up. You're talking about, you have the word crevolution. The Church would use the term theistic evolution. The idea that evolution is describing something that actually happened, but with God as the actor behind the scenes, right? So that's a term called theistic evolution. And in the constant teaching of the Church, most notably and recently Pope Pius XII, Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI, the Church says, fine. Now you may have a friend or a neighbor, and we'll go back to this quote that I absolutely love from Providentissimus Deus. You may have a friend or a neighbor, and upon their reflection on the topic, they say, well, I'm supposed to take the scriptures literally, except where reason makes it untenable, which means except where something that we know as human beings leads us to say, well, that's probably a poetic part of Genesis. But they may, upon reflection, they may say, I just don't see anything unbelievable about the world being created in 6 days, Adam naming all of the animals, and this happening 6,000 years ago. And here's the thing. Now, there may be some educational issues there as far as, but that's the thing is the Church would say, that's fine, because you're supposed to apply your reason to it. The Pope says it's a matter of reason. It means a matter of thinking. It's a matter of when you go and you think about it and you apply what you know, that this is what you should go with. This means that occasionally you'll find somebody in the Catholic Church and they'll be a very, very strict 6-day creationist, 6,000-year-old or a 6-day creationist, and they'll say, well, I believe that because the great saints that lived 1,000 years ago all taught that. And I say, well, absolutely, they applied their reason to it. It was 1,000 years ago. What did we know about the origin of the world 1,000 years ago? Well, very much less than we do now. So I don't particularly see any problem with me coming to a different opinion about that one little topic than some of the great saints, because if I'm applying my reason, I should, if I'm, the benefactor of all of this human investigation in this topic, then I should know more about it, if I paid attention at all, right? There are a lot of permutations between somebody who's a very, very strict believer in Darwinian evolution, and they really think that everything happened by very natural processes. Someone who would be a theistic evolutionist, somebody that says, well, I can see these changes, I can see these fossils, I can see that, chickens look like dinosaurs, or these different things, and they can look at even very detailed information about the human genome and how genetic, the genetic tree of life is put together just in the last 20 years of research, and they can say, I can see all these changes, I don't dispute that, but when I see these animals changing purposefully, I think God's directing it behind the scenes. And the Church says, fine. And then you can have another permutation, which is very popular in Tyler, very popular in Texas, called intelligent design, which is where someone looks at the question and they say, yeah, I can see these changes occurring, all these animals changing over time, but when I see something sprouting a wing and suddenly flying, I'm skeptical that that happened by random chance. I think God probably came in and did that himself. In this one point in time, he probably created this in a continuing act of creation. That's usually termed intelligent design. And the church says, cool, fine. There's actually one cardinal, Cardinal Schoenborn from Vienna, Austria, is one of very few people in the hierarchy of the church. He's a total booster for intelligent design. And all of the Protestant groups in the United States that are boosters for intelligent design, they always quote Cardinal Schoenborn. And I always make fun, why don't they quote him about anything else? But no. So they like the fact that one of the Catholic cardinals is big on intelligent design. And so you have all these different shades of what people think is most reasonable. Well, what the church asks them to do is to apply their reason to it. If you want to know about this, think about it. Read about it. If you care. You don't have to care about this, but living in the United States, where every few years there's some war about textbooks, and there's shows on the Discovery Channel, and we have atheist people on the TV always yelling at us about how stupid we are, I'm glad we have a church that says, learn, apply your mind, apply your reason, be honest about it. So, your idea of crevolution, you have a lot of people behind you, most notably I think St. Augustine agrees with you that this is a reasonable choice to make. Thomas Aquinas, probably the greatest academic, the greatest intellect in the history of the church, really, in a lot of ways. Thomas Aquinas goes down in history as this towering mind. He was so good at systematizing and organizing what the church knows about things that his system of philosophy actually has his name. It's called Thomism. So if you want to read about somebody who was brilliant, read about St. Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas wrote back in the 12th century, he said, the universe was created with a potential to keep developing. He said that's how God created the universe. He said the universe is created with potential. The universe is not exactly the same today as the moment God created it, because God created it with potential. And if God had not created it with potential, then it wouldn't be something different from him. It wouldn't be creator and creation. It would be some other relationship. That's the 1100s. People were talking about ideas just like what you're talking about. So there's a long, long intellectual history in the church of people saying, let's think about it. Let's learn about it. And okay, so one more. We don't have our George Lemaitre fan back in the room yet, but we'll talk about a different Catholic scientist. The whole science of genetics, all of this science that makes all these ideas and all of this research about evolution, these things possible, the father of genetics is a guy named Gregor Mendel. Father Gregor Mendel. He was a Catholic priest. And so the person that invented or discovered genetics, the idea that things are inherited and changed, was a Catholic priest, operating like a Catholic. He said, I want to know how genetics works. I want to know how traits are inherited. I want to know how these things work in biology. Did he go to the Bible and did he read about genetics? No, because the Bible's not a science textbook. He went to his garden and he planted pea plants and he started cross-pollinating pea plants and he wrote books about it, and that's why Father Gregor Mendel is known as the father of genetic science, operating like a Catholic, right? So this long tradition of not being uptight about things, letting science be science, letting religion be religion, and the church only sticking its nose into science certain times, like when in 1950 the Pope said, just remember, the soul didn't evolve. The soul specially created by God. The church only sticking its nose in when some scientific idea threatens to lead people astray from a truth of the faith. It's really the only time the church ever gets involved in it. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Anyway, I know this is a pretty heavy topic. I know it can be a little bit droning on, but like I said, it would have been really important to me to know. I think it probably is, like, people comes up in their jobs and things. So this is an interesting thing. One of the things that I think that you find out about this whole idea of the church relating to science and history and this stuff is that Catholics are not uptight about it. And the reason why Catholics are not uptight about it is, first of all, this is old hat to Catholics. This has been going on for 2,000 years. The second reason Catholics are not uptight about it is this expectation that truth is true no matter where you find it, and if you just be Catholic and you proceed forward, generation to generation, that eventually science will catch up with you. That eventually the things that you hold to be truths of the faith, that eventually science will catch up. Now, we have to talk about the gentleman that brought up Father Lemaitre. I have to bring him up now because the Big Bang's a really good example of this. You know, in olden times, up to the last century, up through the 18th and 19th century, all the way, it was always the religious people that believed that the universe had a beginning. Religious people always said, well, one day God created the universe. And it was always atheistic people that said, no, that's silly. The universe doesn't change. Go outside, look at the stars. They never change. We think the universe has always existed. There's no need to say that God created the universe. It's always been here. And religious people kind of said, it's fine. We're just going to keep believing God created the universe. And atheistic people through the 18th and 19th centuries laughed at them a lot and said, silly religious people. They think that God created the universe, that there was some cataclysmic event. It's creation, when we can clearly see nothing of the sort happened. The universe has been here eternally. And then, in about 1929, there was a great scientific discovery made by Georges Lemaitre, Father Georges Lemaitre, a Catholic priest, and it was within a few years, it had swept the whole scientific establishment, taken over the idea of the Big Bang. And now, the tables are turned. If you were to get into a debate with an atheist about where the universe came from, they would say it was the Big Bang. And they've completely switched. It used to be that the proof against the Catholics was that the universe had always been here. Now the proof against the Catholics is the opposite thing. Now it's the idea the universe came into being one day, and the Catholics just kind of sit back, scratch their heads, and go, y'all silly. The Catholics say, look, we know God created the universe. It's a revealed truth of the faith. It's revealed to us through the Jewish religion, revealed to us by Christ, revealed to us by the church. We're going to keep on believing it. We're glad all y'all have finally caught up with us. We're glad that now the whole world believes, like the Catholic Church always taught, that the universe started on a particular day at a particular time because God said so. And now everyone in the world, if they want to seem intelligent, they want to seem hip, they believe in the Big Bang, right? And now you can find that on the Discovery Channel. This is the way things go for us. We have the truths of the faith. We say we're going to believe them day in, day out, no matter what. We're going to let the world, Catholics, some Catholics are scientists, some scientists are not Catholic, most of them these days are not. Let them do their thing. They'll eventually catch up with us, right? The Big Bang's a good example. This is another really interesting example. So one of the things that was coming around in the 20th century, if everybody's all excited about evolution, people evolved. We can find skulls in Africa, name them things like Lucy, things like that, show this evolutionary chain. And the Pope said, particularly Pope Pius XII, was concerned that Catholics knew, what to watch out for. And Pope Pius XII said, yeah, okay, we're glad you're doing that research, but remember, there was an Adam, there was somebody, there was a first human being, because we know that that first human being did something very important to all the rest of us. We know that first human being sinned. An animal cannot sin because an animal doesn't have a human soul. An animal is not an intellectual being making moral decisions. The Pope said, we know it's a truth of the faith, it's a truth of the Catholic faith, that there was a first person, and that this person made a choice not to follow God's will, but to be rebellious. This is the first sin. This is the original sin. And so the Pope said, so if you have these notions that you're getting from science outside the church, that there wasn't a first human being, if you're getting this notion that there was like this gradual change and you had this large population of thousands of individuals and they gradually became human, the church says, no. What makes someone human is the soul. A human being, what makes them a human being is the soul. This is particularly what separates a human being from any animal, is the human soul, the rational soul. Now, I know the idea of a soul is very unpopular in the world at large. Most people, atheist people particularly, do not want to believe they have a soul. But the Catholic Church teaches, of course you have a soul. The soul is what gives you human faculties. Without the soul, you wouldn't be human. An animal doesn't have a human soul. So the degree to which you believe you are different from an animal, even a smart one like a dolphin, the degree to which you believe you are different from an animal, that's the degree to which you believe you have a soul. It should be no surprise that one of the primary projects of organized atheism over the last 100 years has been to teach animals to talk. How many projects in psychology and anthropology have been aimed at teaching gorillas to talk or dolphins to talk? One of the things you have to be aware of is the church is like, we like science. We like that science works. We like that we can discover things about the world, but we don't like when it's used for political purposes, particularly against us. So the idea is that a lot of atheistically oriented projects that go on are to do things like try to convince us that chimpanzees are exactly like us and, you know, dolphins are smarter than we are, and we can teach gorillas to talk and do philosophy when they can't. They don't have a rational soul. They don't have a human intellect. Catholics believe that we are very different from animals. We're different in kind, not just degree. Yes, we're smart. We're smarter than animals. But we also have a very, very important difference. We're rational. We can reason. We can reason and infer. We can imagine the future. We have a different type of existence than an animal does. And the Pope made the point. The Pope said, this happened on a particular day, at a particular time. There was a first human being that God gave an immortal soul to. This was the first person, and it was the first person capable of making a decision for or against obedience to God. Does that make sense? So this is where the Pope and all the Catholic theologians before him, all he was doing was saying, we still haven't changed our mind, we still believe this, that there was an event, that this first sin was a real thing. And so he was saying this because some Catholics were starting to believe that there wasn't really a first human, that it was just this broad thing that happened with thousands and millions of individuals. And the Pope said, nope, you can't believe in it. This is called polygenism. It's an error and you can't believe it. And everybody's like, okay. It's really interesting. When the Pope said this back in 1950, there were a lot of people that said, oh, that was unwise, Holy Father. You shouldn't have said that. Science is going to prove you wrong. And like I said, the notion that Catholics have is whatever. We're going to keep believing our truths, wait for you to catch up. And I don't know if you remember the news. Remember, it was a generation ago now. It was back in 1987. All the newspapers carried the story, the great scientific discovery of mitochondrial Eve. Anybody remember that from the New York Times? When scientists proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that at one point in time, sometime between 50 and 200,000 years ago, the human race came from one individual. That there had been a reduction in the human population. They've all scratched their heads about it ever since. How could the human population have gone down such a small number of people? Why, evolutionarily, it makes no sense. The Catholic Church didn't start crowing about it. The Catholic Church didn't, contact the New York Times and say, see, we told you so. The Catholic Church just sits back and says, keep doing what you do. Keep investigating. Keep researching. We're going to keep on being Catholic. We'll wait for you to catch up with us. This is just one of many, many, many times that's happened in the history of human intellectual endeavor. Does that make sense? Anyway, the idea of Eve, that they discovered Eve, that genetically the whole world, all human populations came from one woman a long time ago, that may or may not turn out someday to have anything to do with Eve the way we know that first woman and her husband Adam, the people that committed the first sin. But it's tantalizing and it points to it. And what I think it shows us is that we have very good reason to have our faith that these things are not anti-intellectual, they're not anti-scientific. We should hold them for religious reasons, not worry about things. Let the rest of the world do what it does. Does that make sense? So, The last topic we're going to cover tonight is original sin, which is that first sin that was committed by Adam, particularly. The Jewish religion and the Catholic religion, we have a very family-oriented structure. A lot of people hate this. A lot of people hate this about the Catholic Church. We have a very family-oriented structure. There's always a mom and there's always a dad. And they have very mom and dad jobs all throughout Jewish history and Catholic history. People hate that about us, but it's the way we are. Because if you read the account in Genesis, you'll say, what does the account say? Well, the account says that both people, both members of this couple, Adam and Eve, that they were both involved in committing this sin, but that Adam's the one that got bawled out by God. When it came time to address the human family, you've done wrong, God particularly brought the hammer down on Dad. That's an aspect of the human condition, not so much in Tyler, Texas. One of the reasons I'm glad we live in Tyler, Texas. In Tyler, Texas, I think we're a little more comfortable in our skins. We're a little more comfortable being who we are. But obviously, in a lot of places, it would be very offensive to someone that God didn't single out Eve and yell at her just as much. But like I said, we're very family-oriented. For thousands of years, we've been family-oriented. That if you address the family, if you're going to yell at somebody, you're going to yell at the guy. It would be rude and impolite. Speaking of yelling at people, I'll tell you a story. I was thinking the other day about what I was going to say to you tonight, how I was going to, what I was going to do with this class. I need to bring out this point and this point. I was thinking original sin, that's a difficult topic. How am I going to express original sin? The idea that Adam and Eve's sin still affects us today, and it still leads us to do bad things that we know we shouldn't do. And I thought, what example am I going to bring up, of when, like from my own life, of when I've done something and I recognize that it's because I'm a human being, I inherited this sinful tendency. I was sitting on the side of the road in my car while I was thinking about this, and I actually had sold the car. It's a great car. I sold it for $4,000. You can imagine what a great car I had. I had just sold the car. I was on my way to meet the guy to pick up the car, and I was sitting there saying, what am I going to say? How am I going to express how original sin affects us and makes us do the wrong thing? And at that moment, a minivan backed up, and I saw it just in the mirror before it crunched the car, backed up into my bumper, and the car lurched. And I thought, I was about to go get a check for this car. So I threw open the door, I jumped out into the street, I grabbed the minivan by the driver's window, I leaned in the window, and I started yelling at the people inside. It was a man and a woman. I was yelling at the man, patriarchal Catholic. I was yelling at him, and I said, get out of the car, give me your driver's license right now. I was yelling. And then I realized in the middle of it, it's perfect. You know that a car is not that important. You know that yelling at strangers who, for all I know, they were going to be sitting at this table tonight. What a horrible witness that would have been for the church if they came in and saw me, the guy that yelled at them. They called him canceled. Every week, Father McLaughlin or Father Braun or Father Lopez tells me to be charitable and to be kind and to do these things, not to be focused on money and temporal goods. I know all of these things. And yet, the other day, 2 days ago, when the couple backed into my car and crunched my car, I immediately reverted to like caveman mode. And I was yelling and screaming for about a minute. I yelled and screamed, and I could just, the veins were standing out, and my face is all red. And then I realized, original sin. You've just been victimized by it.
Did you tell him that?
I did. I apologized to him. But what went through my mind, and I said, okay, now I know what I'm going to say about original sin. I said the same thing that Paul said in Romans. Paul says, for I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, and this I keep on doing. I know better than to yell at somebody in the street. I'm a catechist of the cathedral. People see me. I stand up in front of thousands of people a year and I say, love your neighbor, love God, do these things. And then they see me in the street with my veins standing out and yelling and screaming over a $4,000 car. This is how I prove original sin. One of the very first things that a Catholic theologian ever said to me during our RCIA process. One of the things that was a light bulb moment for me is we were watching a presentation, a videotape by a little tiny wizened old Franciscan monk. A Franciscan monk who runs a monastery in New York City where they minister to homeless people. And he was giving a sermon about original sin. And he said, original sin. He said, you don't believe it? Come to New York. I'll show you. And he was telling a story. He said, if you walk around New York City, he said, you see all the people that are trapped in all of their sins. And he said, don't you think they know better? Don't you think all of these people who've ended up derelicts, don't you think that intellectually they know what's good for them and they know what's bad and they don't have the willpower to do these things? He said, original sin, this inherited condition of being prone to sin, of being prone to do wrong, which we inherit from our first parents. He said it's one of the few doctrines of Christianity you can prove by just walking down the street. And boy, if anybody had been walking down the street the other day, if they had been walking down Rice Street the other day and seen me with my little performance, they would have said, look, original sin right there. That guy's obviously got it. And so when you think about this, you say, I'm thinking about joining the Catholic Church. I'm thinking about jumping headlong into this, very, very deep relationship with Christianity and these doctrines and these ideas and these things that I'm supposed to put my faith into and say, I need to, how am I going to believe, how am I going to make these things my own? Well, the next time you freaking lose it at somebody and yell at them, you can say, I've just proved original sin to myself. I've just proven that I am affected by this, just like the rest of the world. That I'm supposed to be, the atheists would have me believe I'm the smartest animal that there could possibly be. But when was the last time you saw an animal do something self-destructive? Even a dumb animal. When was the last time that you saw an animal do something self-destructive? Well, here, if you're an atheist and you say, here's the smartest, not just the smartest, but thousands of times smarter and more intelligent than any animal, why would a human being ever do anything destructive? It's unbelievable and it makes no sense unless you, like Paul, and you admit this is the human condition, living in original sin, needing Jesus, needing the church, needing this life with God to try to improve myself day by day. Failing. If Paul can fail at it, I don't feel quite so bad that I yelled out some poor guy named Shane driving a minivan. Paul apparently did the same thing. He probably had a chariot wreck or something. If Paul can fail at it, we can all fail at it. If you've read any of what Paul wrote or listened to any of what Paul wrote in the epistles, every single mass, then you know that Paul really believed, really believed the Catholic faith. And Paul says, but even that, he said, I can't escape the fact that I'm affected by this sin of Adam. It came down to me through all of the human race. And that's why the Pope makes a point. The Pope says, Catholics, you have to remember, you're all affected by sin. You're all affected by the original sins committed by Adam and Eve. You inherited it, and it's going to affect you your entire life. This is why you're not going to be immediately perfect. This is why your spiritual life is going to be hard work. This is why you're going to do the wrong things. This is why during this year of RCIA, you're going to learn about the remedies for this. You're going to learn about baptism as the first remedy for original sin. You're going to learn about confession. Confession. Wonderful, frightening, awful, beautiful, terrible, great confession, which is where we have the particular sins that we commit because we're prone to it, because of original sin. The particular sins that we commit where we go to have them forgiven. You'll learn about all of these things. But they all start here. They start here with the idea that we're sinful people from a sinful race. We started out that way. And then, of course, as a little kid, hearing the story of Adam and Eve, you're like, oh, man, that's not fair. They sinned, and I get all these bad things that happen to me. But, of course, then you realize, oh, if I had been there, I would have sinned too. Well, maybe then it's not unjust. Maybe it's just we're all in this together. And so Next time you hear a phrase like the brotherhood of man or something like that, remember the Catholic understanding of the brotherhood of man is that we're all messed up together and we're all sinful together. It's not exactly the happiest thing in the Catholic religion to say the brotherhood of man, because one of the things that we're joined in is sin and unhappiness. So, those are the topics that we were supposed to cover. We have a few minutes. Does anyone have any questions so that I can do a bad job of answering it? There's got to be one. Somebody throw me a lifeline here. There's got to be at least one.
Did you sell your car?
You know, it was really something. The people that I was selling it to, they were buying it for their 16-year-old son. We met. I showed them the bumper. And they said, don't worry, by the time it gets home, it'll have 3 or 4 more just like it. And I'm like, oh, thank goodness. So they sold me the car. So I got mad for nothing, which is a perfect story about original sin. Because it's completely irrational because, you know, $4,000 car. A one.
$4,000 was flying out of the car.
Yes, well, that's the whole thing. Here I was sitting in the car, you know, thinking about, oh my gosh, all that money, it's just gone, gone, gone. And then you think about it and you say, what did Father McLaughlin tell me last weekend? Did he tell me if somebody costs you money, you should become outraged? No, of course not. Father McLaughlin was saying, be charitable. Be ready to give your money away if somebody needs it. Don't worry about such things. And I'm thinking, I'm sitting there in the pew, this perfect original sin story. I'm sitting there in the pew, and I'm saying, I do that so well. I'm such a good Catholic. I would never, ever, ever do anything wrong about money. I'm such a good Catholic. And the first rattle out of the box the next week, I'd have lost it. It's a good original sin story, I think. Anyway, so then, you know, I felt like a complete fool. But at the same time, I had a nice story to tell you that I think highlights this in a personal way. I could talk about these things. I could drone on about the heritability of original sin and these different things, the effects, and I could define concupiscence and all that, but you can find that in the Catechism yourself. Instead, just remember, the idea is this is hard work to improve yourself, that God offers you the graces through the sacraments, that if you live the Catholic life, you have the ammo, you have the resources, but then you got to do it. So I've been Catholic since 1988. I've been receiving the sacraments, and I've been living the Catholic life, and so I should be almost perfect now, right? Thankfully, Paul says, I'm not perfect either, which gives me hope. All right, does that all make sense? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.